Today I want to explain to you the difference between an emotional flashback and an emotional hangover, because I've heard both of them used almost interchangeably or in a context where maybe it should have been the other one. So the emotional flashback is literally if something happens to you that reminds your system of something that has happened to it in the past. Words, people, situations, environments, it could be anything. And you might be going through your day, everything's fine and you're feeling great, you're feeling neutral, but not in any particular way aroused. I mean, positive arousal is always cool, but generally you're just going along as everything's more or less fine. And all of a sudden you're thrown into a really intense emotional reaction. And usually it's something like fear, anxiety, anger, despair, sadness, grief, like something strong that kind of throws you off or drags you down. And you might not be able to explain to you why all of a sudden you feel horrible. Because it might be, that there's still something that on a subconscious level you might have not processed or you weren't aware of. And again, something triggered that thing. It could be, a person you've known in the past or an environment you've known in the past. It could be, again, like how someone speaks to you, or you could even see something on TV. And, again, because so much of, if we have experienced, especially if we have experienced terrible things in the past, trauma or otherwise just things that, made our bodies react really strongly, but maybe we weren't able to express it at the time. Yeah, you like, again, it's still it's still stored in your subconscious, and that's what's triggered in that moment. And that's why you have this, either it could be numbing, freezing, or it could be also an outburst. So there are different ways of how it could, what could be triggered in you and how it lives out. And because you're having a strong emotional reaction in that moment, of course, what you have to do is to calm yourself down in whatever way you need. Very often that will need slowing things down, seeing if you can take a deep breath. I think I'm a fan of, I mentioned that before, soothing touch, or, maybe something you would just want to touch a surface or a wall or feel your feet on the ground, something that brings you back into the present, so that your system can get used to, oh, we're actually in a safe space. Because if you're having a flashback, your system thinks that you're not in a safe space. So you have to do whatever you need to do, reassure yourself, talk quietly, calming to yourself to calm your system back down. Often, of course, our inner critic can be in that moment, really flare up. How do we need to calm that down? And again, there are lots of tools and strategies for that. If you need them, either a link or some resources, or I'll do another video about that. Now, the emotional hangover, on the other hand, is more that you could have a hangover from a flashback, actually. Basically, it's really you feeling drained or exhausted, because I would say generally in the hangover, you weren't able again to express certain emotions, but it's more in the here and now. So you could have a hangover from an unexpressed flashback. Very often when people say, oh, I'm having a hangover, is because they're linked, the flashback and the hangover. So you could go back into your family environment, spend some time with your family, and maybe, the way your family works, it's a bit of a difficult situation every time for you. And afterwards you feel completely drained because you weren't able to be as you would have liked to be, say the things you would have wanted to do, show your emotions as you would have liked to, because in your family that's not accepted or allowed, or people wouldn't be okay with it, or any of these things that cause us to have unregulated nervous systems in the first place. That's why I say it could be linked to a flashback. So you might go, for example, back into a family, or it could be a work environment, get triggered, have potentially a flashback there, and then afterwards feel drained because, even with a flashback, you couldn't fully give everything you would have needed to calm down the flashback, to maybe even manage to heal the flashback, and then you're emotionally drained having a hangover. But generally, like I said, that's a small difference between the hangover. What else could it be? You could just have a strong or even traumatic event. You could, be in an accident. You could even just witness an accident on the road, or, maybe a loved one is very ill for a while, and it's just, and how these things go. We try to do whatever we can to nourish ourselves. Well, hopefully you do everything you can to nourish yourself while you go through it, but it's still it can be so intense. And again, you can't process everything at the time. that afterwards you're feeling drained. So that's why in a way they're different and they're similar, because the flashback is unprocessed stuff from the past getting reenacted, being triggered again, seeing if you can or can now, express maybe what you couldn't back then. And if you can't, you end up in a hangover. Like, for example, with the example of an accident, most of the time, if something happens very fast and sudden, it can be really tough to stay present and have things processed through you while it happens. Most of us, we will shut down or seize up or do something that we don't feel everything that's going on at the time, because we couldn't really react and stay, that's what, of course, shutting down or fighting is meant for, is that if something strong happens, that right now we were just focusing on survival and we're dealing with the emotions later. But if that never happens or is stopped for some reason, that's of course when either, and I just call it trauma for the sake of, because I think if you're aware of trauma is a classic example of stuff not having been able to express or processed, or someone not being able to witness yourself while something horrible happened to you. In a way, the hangover is actually great, because at least it gives you a sign that there is stuff you still need to process. If it's buried so deep or shut down so deep, buried in one way or another, that you almost don't even feel drained from, like, if it becomes, if stuff really gets buried in our bodies and we're not even consciously aware of it, then we might still get, that's more when we get the chronic problems. We get, chronic stress or chronic tiredness or something, or can get it from that at least, because we're not even aware of what needs to be processed, of course, very often. Whereas with a hangover, let's say if you're lucky, or in some situations, I know where people have used the term, that's why I thought about it, they kind of know at least like why they're drained, and now they have to do the self-care. So if you're having a hangover, going through these feelings and expressing them is still very important, but also critical. Just nourishing yourself, with sleep, with food, with going into nature, talking to friends, having a healing therapy session, whatever you need to do, having a bath, water, of course, also can really be supportive. You also recalibrate your nervous system. But with a hangover, it's really often, it's primarily that exhaustion. And then the more you calm down, often you're able to process things then. Or I would really encourage you, if it feels safe to you, see how much you can process when you feel you're having a hangover. Whereas with a flashback, it really depends. If it's really intense, like I said, the first call is to make sure you're in the present, you're grounded, and it's not, like I said, going into a panic or anything that you feel like you can't control. But then, of course, equally, you want to do the work and see, like, why are you even having that flashback? Like, what is still in there? Like, what can you find out what triggered you and why it triggered you? And that's the thing with flashbacks. Sometimes it's not necessarily always obvious. Like, why? Like, I had a situation recently where I was like, whoa, why is that person triggering me? Like, I have no bad memories with this person. But it was just, and I still can't fully tell you, but it was just something, like from the past where I was a different person, that person possibly was a different person, and I possibly wasn't my strongest, best self when we interacted. And I think I was just kind of, in my subconscious, there were just, I think, old ways of being, old ways of behaviors were just triggered, which anyway, it's almost hard to explain. I was just really surprised. So I just sat with it when I had the time and be like, okay. And basically I just stayed with what's coming up and with the feelings until I was like, okay, it's not triggering me anymore. It was a mild example, but that definitely was a flashback when I was just, you kind of, like I said, it comes often very much out of the blue, that all of a sudden you completely reacting about something and you just can't explain why that is. And again, like I said, then depending of, you need to calm yourself down, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just know something makes you really feel bad. Then what do you need to do to feel good again? It's like that's, calming ourselves, nourishing ourselves, always great. But again, with the flashbacks, often also, can you find out what triggered you, of course, because then you can work with the trigger if it's something you need to watch out for, or simply something you can, heal around so it doesn't trigger you in the future anymore. But I think you can see also where that overlaps with, like, often when I see people saying they're having emotional hangovers, they know why they have them, but you could be just drained and exhausted, and yeah, you possibly have a sense of what situation caused it, but sometimes you still need to have a little bit of a look with that as well, or be clear of maybe you can put better boundaries in place for the next time, or how can you strengthen and nourishing yourself. Again, like it is of course family situations or people, work situations, family situations, certain situations where they're just not going as you wish, and if you have to be there anyway, like what can you do to make it more, I say, enjoyable. I mean, we don't always go to enjoy, tolerable, but then if you can, of course, keep choosing something, a higher feeling, if you can. And sometimes ultimately we, of course, also there are situations where we simply need to remove ourselves. Yeah, I hope that was helpful. I'm just thinking, I mean, it's there, of course, like, I touched on points where there's a lot more to what can cause it and how you nourish and resource yourself. Even though with those ones, it kind of always tends to come back to the same things: grounding yourself, being present, physically nourishing yourself, and looking how much you want or you can inquire into something. Like ultimately, we come back to similar tools, I would say. But it's still important, I find, sometimes to know why we're feeling off, why we're feeling funky, and why or what it might have triggered. And that's what I was trying to do with this video. So as always, let me know if you find that helpful. If there's something else I can clarify for you, or any points you want me to go deeper on. And then I hope to see you again next time. Bye bye.